Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Ashes and Wild Roses. The wind in Montana had a voice. It was not the hurried, indifferent whisper of city air, but a deep, lonely sigh that swept down from the mountains and across the plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a distant, clean rain. It was a sound that hollowed out the world, leaving a vast, intimidating space that mirrored the emptiness inside Dona. She stepped out of the hired car, her tailored blazer and sharp city trousers a jarring note against the wild, untamed landscape of the sprawling wildlife sanctuary. The fabric meant for boardrooms and investor meetings felt thin and useless against the sheer scale of the sky. At 32, Dona felt ancient. The empire she had built, an intricate architecture of code and algorithms, had vanished in a single catastrophic keystroke, market crash, a betrayal, a public humiliation. It had taken everything, including her engagement to Julian, her co-founder, and the man who had shared her ambition like a second skin. Now she was a refugee, fleeing the double wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. He was waiting for her on the porch of the main ranch house, a figure so perfectly a part of the landscape that he seemed carved from the same weathered wood as the building itself. Tristin was 38, but the lines around his eyes held the patience of a much older man, the kind of patience born from watching seasons turn and mountains stand unmoving. He didn't smile, but his greeting was polite, his gaze steady and reserved. He had seen volunteers like her before, idealists with haunted eyes, running from something sharp-edged and urban, who rarely lasted until the first snow. He showed her to a small, clean cabin, the air inside smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Her luggage, a set of sleek, hard-shelled cases, looked absurdly out of place on the rustic pine floor. She wanted to unpack, to create a semblance of order, but her hands felt useless, clumsy. I built an empire of code and it vanished in a keystroke, she thought, the words a bitter, silent refrain. What am I supposed to do with something so real, so broken? Her primary responsibility was a horse. Tristin led her to a far corral away from the other animals. The creature inside was a maelstrom of barely contained energy, a wounded mustang recently rescued and vibrating with a profound, wild mistrust. A jagged scar, pale and puckered against its dark coat, marred its flank like a brand. He was trapped in a barbed wire fence, Tristin said, his voice low and even. Took us 3 days to get him here. He's not ready for company. He simply called him the Mustang. Dona, looking at the fire that burned in the animal's dark, intelligent eyes, a fire that mirrored the ruin in her own soul, privately named him Ash. Her first attempts to connect with the horse were a disaster. She approached the fence with the same nervous, goal-oriented energy that had served her so well in securing venture capital. She held out a hand, her voice a low, placating murmur. Ash responded by rearing back, his nostrils flaring, his powerful body a tense sculpture of fear and defiance. He shied away from the frantic hum of her thoughts, the scent of her failure. Tristin watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post, his silence a more potent form of judgment than any words could have been. She felt it acutely, a familiar heat rising in her cheeks. After her third failed attempt, he walked over, his stride unhurried. "He knows you're in a hurry," he said, not unkindly. "Horses always know. You can't lie to them." Dona's hands clenched at her sides. In her world, speed was a virtue, a necessity. Patience was a luxury for those who could afford to wait. She had never been one of them. That evening, a brief, sharp shower swept across the plains, and the air filled with the clean, almost holy scent of wet sagebrush. Dona stood at the window of her cabin, watching the last light bleed from the sky. The metallic clang of the stable gate swinging shut in the wind echoed the sound of a door closing on her old life, a sound she had been hearing in her sleep for weeks. The vast, empty space of Montana didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage, bigger and more terrifying than the one she had left behind. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by deadlines and product launches, but by the slow, immutable rhythms of the sanctuary. The rising sun, the pre-dawn feedings, the long, quiet hours of labour. Donna shed her city skin layer by layer. The sharp angles of her posture softened. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth, cool surface of a keyboard, became calloused and capable. The vastness of the landscape, once so intimidating, began to feel less like a void and more like a space to finally breathe. She changed her approach with Ash. Instead of trying to do something to achieve a result, she simply began to be. She would bring a folding chair and a worn paperback into his enclosure, sit just inside the fence and read aloud. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the familiar cadence of the printed word. She read Austen and Bronte, the measured, elegant prose a stark contrast to the wildness around them. For days the horse ignored her, standing at the far end of the corral, his scarred flank turned pointedly towards her. But gradually he began to watch her. His ears would swivel in her direction, his head lifting from its grazing. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the plains, he took a single, deliberate step toward her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her, his breathing a soft, rhythmic huff in the quiet air. Donna didn't move, didn't breathe. She just kept reading, her voice a low, steady murmur, a fragile thread of connection woven in the vast silence. Tristin found her there late one evening, long after her official duties were done. The sky was a deep velvet indigo, studded with an impossible number of stars, a universe away from the light-polluted skies of the city. She was just sitting with the horse, the book lying closed in her lap. Ash stood nearby, utterly calm, occasionally dropping his head to nudge her shoulder. Tristin didn't speak at first. He simply handed her a thick ceramic mug, the warmth seeping through into her cold hands. The coffee was strong and black, and it tasted of the fire it had been brewed over. This time he didn't retreat to a polite distance. He leaned against the fence beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the ancient pines that dotted the landscape. It was their first real conversation. She spoke vaguely of her past, of a project that didn't work out, the words feeling flimsy and inadequate to describe the scale of her failure. He listened without judgment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he told her about the mustang. "We found him after a wildfire swept through the basin last year," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That scar on his flank, it's a burn. He was the only one of his herd that made it out. The fire took everything else." He paused, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "The land always comes back, though. After a fire, things grow back stronger. Different, but stronger." The quiet, rhythmic sound of Ash chewing hay in the nearby barn was the only sound for a long moment. Donna looked down at the coffee mug in her hands, its simple earthy warmth, a profound comfort. "In my world," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if something breaks, you discard it and get a new one. You don't with it." "Out here," Tristin replied, his gaze returning to the vast star-dusted sky. "Nothing's ever really new. It's just a different version of what's always been. Scars are just part of the story." She looked up at the Milky Way, a brilliant, shimmering river of light that seemed to pour across the heavens. For the first time in months, the crushing weight in her chest seemed to lift, just a little. She felt a tentative, fragile peace begin to settle in her soul. a peace as quiet and vast as the Montana night. The peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. It was fractured by the sound of a luxury rental car crunching its way up the gravel drive, the low, aggressive hum of its engine, an alien sound in the sanctuary's quiet. And then the sharp, insistent ring of a cell phone, a sound Donna hadn't heard in weeks, a sound that made the muscles in her shoulders instantly tense. Julian stood on the porch of her cabin, looking handsome, charismatic, and utterly, profoundly out of place. His Italian loafers were polished to a high sheen, and the dust of the sanctuary seemed to actively refuse to stick to them. His cologne, a cold, sterile scent she had once associated with success, now smelled only of confinement. He said he'd come to get her back. He said he missed her. But his language was the language of their old life, a dialect of mergers and acquisitions, of salvaging their professional reputation, of second-round funding and market shares. He spoke of her time at the sanctuary as a charming rustic sabbatical, a quaint little detour before her inevitable return to the real world. He framed her failures as problems he and only he could solve. "Come back, Donna," he urged, his hand resting on her arm with an easy, familiar possessiveness. "We can fix this. Don't throw away your entire life for a bunch of stray animals and a man who probably doesn't even own a decent suit." Tristin saw them together from across the yard. He saw Julian's hand on her arm, saw the familiar tense set of her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He gave a single brief nod in their direction and then turned away, his retreat so complete, so absolute, that it was as if a door had been quietly but firmly closed between them. He was once again the polite, distant caretaker, his eyes holding nothing but the vast, impersonal patience of the landscape. Donna felt herself torn in two. Julian spoke her old language, a language of ambition and validation, a language she had once craved more than anything. Why did it sound so foreign now? Why did it feel like a cage? Tristin represented a peace she was only just beginning to believe she deserved, a quiet, steady strength that felt more real, more valuable than any stock option or public offering. The conflict was a storm inside her, and Ash, with his preternatural sensitivity, felt every turbulent gust. He became agitated, difficult, shying away from her touch, his eyes rolling with a familiar wild fear. He was a mirror, reflecting the turmoil of her own fractured soul. Julian stayed for 2 days, his presence a constant low-grade irritant. His phone buzzed incessantly, a nervous, anxious sound that grated on the sanctuary's deep, abiding silence. He talked of their future, a future that sounded exactly like their past, a future that felt like a beautifully appointed, elegantly furnished prison. On the second evening, as Julian was once again outlining a strategy for their professional comeback, Donna found herself looking past him, out the window of her cabin, towards the distant, darkening mountains. She felt a profound, aching longing for the quiet companionship of the man who smelled of sagebrush and wood smoke, for the simple, uncomplicated trust of the wounded horse who was just beginning to heal. She was standing on a precipice, the life she had built on one side, a new, unknown, and terrifyingly beautiful world on the other, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she could not go back. The storm broke that night, a sudden, violent squall that descended upon the plains with the force of a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple-grey, shot through with jagged veins of lightning. The wind howled, a primal, cathartic scream that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The storm terrified Ash. He was a creature of the wild, a creature of fire and instinct, and the violent, elemental fury of the thunderstorm sent him into a blind panic. With a sound that was half scream, half whinny, he crashed through the fence of his corral and bolted, a dark, frantic shape disappearing into the rain-lashed darkness. heading for the treacherous rocky hillsides. "Let him go," Julian shouted, grabbing Donna's arm as she made a move to run after the horse. "Be reasonable, Donna, it's just an animal." His words, so calm, so logical, so utterly dismissive of the wild, beautiful, broken thing that had become the centre of her world, were the final, irrevocable straw. She shook off his hand, her eyes blazing with a cold, clear fury that made him take a step back. She found Tristin by the stables, already saddling his own horse, his movements economical and sure in the flickering light of a lantern. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded towards the second horse, already saddled and waiting. Without a word, a silent, unbreakable understanding passing between them in the heart of the storm, she swung herself into the saddle. They rode out together into the tempest, a silent, determined team, the driving rain plastering their hair to their faces, the wind tearing at their clothes. They found Ash in a narrow ravine, his leg caught in a tangle of fallen branches, his eyes wide with terror. The sound of their approach sent him into a fresh panic, but Tristin's voice, low and steady, a calm, reassuring rumble beneath the roar of the storm, seemed to reach the terrified animal. Working together in the driving rain, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken purpose, they managed to calm the horse, to gentle him, to free him from the tangle of branches. The journey back to the barn was a slow, arduous one. Ash was limping, and they had to lead the horses, their boots sinking into the mud, the wind and rain a constant punishing assault. When they finally reached the shelter of the main barn, they were soaked, shivering and emotionally raw. The storm still raged outside, the rain drumming a frantic, relentless rhythm on the roof, but inside, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, there was a strange, profound silence. They stood facing each other, the lantern light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. And in that moment, with the storm raging around them and the shared, profound relief of the rescue settling in their souls, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. He reached out and brushed a stray wet strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. The touch lingered, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The kiss that followed was slow and searching at first, a question asked in the dark. But the recognition in that touch, of shared wildness, of a resilience forged in fire, ignited something primal. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, hungry claiming. It was the taste of rain and earth, and a longing so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. His hands were rough and sure, tangling in her wet hair, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the hard strength of his body, the frantic beat of his heart against her own. Her gasp became a moan as his mouth left hers to trace a fiery path down her throat. Their fumbling with the wet, heavy clothes was an act of desperate urgency. Buttons gave way, denim was pushed aside, and then there was only the shocking electric heat of skin meeting skin in the cool, hay-scented air. He laid her back in a pile of soft hay, the rough strands scratching faintly at her back as his hands and mouth began a slow, deliberate exploration. He worshipped her body with a reverence that made her tremble, his calloused fingertips tracing the curve of her hip, his tongue tasting the salt on her skin. He discovered every secret place, every sensitive hollow, until she was arching against him, a wordless plea on her lips. He brought their bodies together, and it was a homecoming, a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other from the moment they met. The rhythm of the storm outside became their own, a tempest of shared need and shattering relief. It was a silent language of touch and breath, a surrender so complete and absolute that it felt like being broken open and remade, not by force but by a profound and overwhelming tenderness. The storm outside raged on, a wild, untamed symphony of wind and rain, but in the heart of the barn, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, they created their own storm, a wild, beautiful and terrifyingly real moment that burned away the last vestiges of the woman she had been, leaving in its place something new, something stronger, something that had been forged in the heart of the fire. Several weeks later, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible, aching clarity and air that tasted of clean earth and new beginnings. Julian was a ghost, a memory. A final, sterile email from him, confirming the legal dissolution of their company, had arrived a week ago. Dona had deleted it without a single pang of regret, the words dissolving into the digital ether, as ephemeral and meaningless as the life they represented. She walked out to the pasture, the late autumn sun warm on her face. Ash, though still favouring his leg, trotted to meet her, his gait no longer frantic but steady, sure. He nudged her shoulder with his head, a gesture of quiet trust and affection that filled her with a deep, uncomplicated joy. Tristin was waiting for her by the fence line, leaning against it in the sun, his silhouette a familiar, comforting shape against the vast expanse of the plains. He didn't speak, but his eyes, the colour of a clear autumn sky, asked the question that hung in the still, clean air between them. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his without a flicker of doubt. "I've cashed out my remaining assets. I want to invest them in the sanctuary. This is my new venture. This is my home." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the weathered skin at their corners. He pushed himself off the fence and pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and sure. The kiss was no longer just comforting. It was full of promise and a deep, smiling passion. He kissed her like he was memorizing the taste of her, a taste of sun and wind and second chances. His touch was both strong and tender, a silent language that speaks of building a future, of planting roots in this wild, beautiful place. It was a promise whispered against her skin, under the vast, accepting sky. As she stood there, wrapped in his arms, her head resting against his chest, she saw them for the first time, a cluster of wild roses, late blooming and impossibly resilient, growing along the fence line, their delicate, defiant beauty a splash of colour against the weathered wood. She had come here thinking she needed to rebuild a life from the ashes, only to discover that the most beautiful things don't have to be built at all. They simply need the space to grow. Strangers in the candlelight. The rain fell on Paris with a quiet insistence, a silver veil that blurred the edges of the city and turned the cobblestones to slick, dark mirrors. It was a late autumn afternoon, the kind that held the day in a gentle grey embrace, refusing to let go. For Thomas, the rain was a fitting accompaniment to the storm that had been raging inside him for months, a relentless tempest of memories that the end of a war had failed to quell. He walked without purpose, his American uniform feeling heavy and foreign on his shoulders, the cheerful shouts from the cafes and brasseries a language he no longer understood. He was a ghost in a city that was trying so desperately to live again. He turned down a narrow side street away from the main thoroughfare, and found himself before a small dusty bookshop. La Belle Page, the faded sign read. The windows were filled not with the bright covers of new bestsellers, but with the soft, worn spines of older volumes, their titles barely legible in the fading light. It looked less like a shop and more like a sanctuary, a quiet haven from the relentless drizzle and the even more relentless noise of his own thoughts. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival with a delicate chime, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax and brewing tea, a fragrance that seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket. The shop was a labyrinth of towering shelves, books stacked in precarious piles on every available surface, the only light coming from a pair of flickering candles on a small desk in the corner, and the soft grey light filtering through the windows. It was a place of shadows and whispers, a world away from the shattered landscapes and deafening explosions that still echoed in his mind. Behind the desk sat a woman, her head bent over a ledger, a pen moving with a slow, deliberate grace across the page. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment their eyes met across the dim, book-filled space. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face that held the quiet sorrow of a Madonna in a dimly lit church. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and she wore a plain grey dress that seemed to absorb the shadows around her. There was a stillness about her, a palpable sense of grief that clung to her like a fine, invisible dust. She was, he thought, the living embodiment of the shop, a keeper of stories and sorrows. "Bonjour, monsieur," she said, her voice soft, a low melody that seemed to rise from the quiet depths of the room. "Hello," he replied, his own voice sounding rough and out of place. "I was just looking for shelter from the rain." "Of course," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Please, take your time." He nodded, grateful for the dismissal, and began to wander through the narrow aisles, his fingers trailing over the worn leather spines. He was not looking for anything in particular, simply seeking a distraction, a momentary reprieve from the images that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. He pulled a slim volume from a shelf, its pages brittle with age. It was a book of poetry, the words a gentle balm to his raw, frayed nerves. He stood there, lost in the rhythm of the verses, the outside world fading away until there was only the soft rustle of the pages and the steady drumming of the rain against the window pane. "La chair est triste et là, et j'ai lu tous les livres." The voice was so close he started. He turned to find her standing beside him, her eyes on the book in his hands. She had recited the line from memory, her voice a soft, resonant whisper that seemed to fill the silence between them. "Mallarmé," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes," she replied. "A sad poem, for one so young." She looked at him then, her gaze direct and filled with an unspoken understanding, as if she could see the weariness that lay beneath the surface, the ghosts that flickered in his eyes. Poetry is a balm for the soul, is it not? It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is still beauty to be found. He could only nod, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. He had spoken to no one of the darkness that had taken root inside him, yet this stranger, this quiet woman in a dusty bookshop, seemed to understand. "I was just making some tea," she said, as if sensing his inability to speak. "Would you care for a cup?" He found his voice then, a simple "yes, thank you," that felt wholly inadequate. She led him to the small desk in the corner, clearing a space for him amidst the stacks of books and papers. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hand steady as she poured the steaming liquid into 2 delicate porcelain cups. He watched her, mesmerized by the simple grace of her movements, the way the candlelight caught the soft curve of her cheek. They sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle clinking of their cups and the persistent murmur of the rain. The tea was hot and sweet, and he held the cup in his hands, its warmth seeping into his chilled fingers, a small tangible comfort in a world that had grown cold and unforgiving. He found himself studying her face, the fine lines around her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth. Her name, she told him, was Elodie. She had inherited the shop from her husband, a writer, who had been killed in the war. She spoke of him with a quiet, dignified sorrow, her grief a tangible thing, a constant low hum beneath the surface of her words. He did not speak of his own losses, of the faces of the men he had seen fall, of the screams that still echoed in the dead of night. He did not need to. She seemed to know, to understand the weight of the unspoken things that lay between them. As he sat there in the warm, candlelit quiet of the bookshop, a strange sense of peace began to settle over him. It was a feeling he had not known in years, a quiet stillness that seemed to push back, however momentarily the encroaching darkness. He'd come into the shop to escape the rain, but he realized now that it was the storm inside him that was finally beginning to quiet. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter by the time he rose to leave. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the streetlights casting long, wavering reflections on the wet pavement. "Thank you for the tea," he said, his voice still feeling inadequate. "You're welcome any time, monsieur," she replied, her sad, beautiful eyes meeting his. He walked back out into the rain-slicked streets of Paris, the scent of old books and beeswax still clinging to him, the warmth of the teacup still lingering in his hands. He did not know when he would see her again, but he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would. He had found a small, quiet corner of the world where the ghosts of his past seemed, for a moment, to have been laid to rest. He had found a fragile, unexpected sanctuary in the quiet world of a widowed French bookseller, a woman whose own sorrow seemed to mirror the unspoken grief he carried within him. And in the shared silence, in the unspoken understanding that had passed between them, a tiny, fragile spark had been kindled, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. The single visit became a ritual. Every evening, as the last of the daylight bled from the Parisian sky, Thomas found himself drawn back to the quiet sanctity of La Belle Page. He would arrive just as Elodie was preparing to close, the little bell above the door announcing his presence with a sound that was becoming increasingly familiar, a gentle counterpoint to the weary beat of his own heart. He would help her shutter the windows against the encroaching night, the simple physical task a welcome anchor in the swirling currents of his thoughts. Then, with the door locked and the world shut out, they would sit together in the warm, flickering candlelight, the towering shelves of books standing as silent witnesses to their burgeoning connection. At first, their evenings were filled with the comfortable quiet that had marked their first meeting. They would read, sometimes for hours on end, the only sounds the soft rustle of turning pages and the occasional sigh of contentment. He would watch her as she read, the candlelight casting a golden glow on her face, her expression a mixture of concentration and a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to have settled into the very lines of her being. He learned the contours of her face by heart, the gentle slope of her nose, the delicate curve of her lips, the way a stray strand of dark hair would escape from its simple knot and curl against the soft skin of her neck. Slowly, tentatively, the silence between them began to fill with words. She would read a passage aloud, her voice a low melodic murmur that seemed to bring the poetry to life, and he would listen, captivated, the verses weaving a fragile tapestry of shared emotion around them. He found himself speaking of things he had never spoken of before, not to the army doctors with their clinical questions and detached sympathy, not even to his own family in the carefully censored letters he sent home. He spoke of the endless, bone-wearing boredom of the trenches, of the sudden, terrifying bursts of violence that shattered the monotony, of the quiet, gnawing fear that was a constant companion. The words tumbled out of him, hesitant at first, then with a growing urgency, as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of pent-up grief and confusion. She listened without judgment, her quiet presence a steady, unwavering anchor in the storm of his confession. And in return she began to speak of her own loss, of her husband, Antoine, a man whose love for words had been as deep and profound as her own. She spoke of their shared dreams, of the life they had planned to build together within the book-lined walls of the shop, a life that had been stolen from them by the same war that had left Thomas so irrevocably broken. She showed him a small faded photograph of a smiling young man with kind eyes and a shock of unruly dark hair, his image a ghostly presence in the small intimate world they were creating. "I told myself I would never love again," she confessed one evening, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears in the candlelight. It felt like a betrayal. He reached across the small space that separated them and took her hand, his fingers gently closing around hers. It was the first time they had touched, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and unexpected, shot through him. Her skin was soft and cool, and he could feel the delicate flutter of her pulse beneath his thumb. He did not know what to say, what comfort he could possibly offer to a grief that so closely mirrored his own. So he simply held her hand, his touch a silent acknowledgement of their shared sorrow. He found himself looking at her in a new way, his gaze lingering on the gentle curve of her neck, the soft swell of her breasts beneath the simple grey dress. He noticed the scent of her perfume, a faint, elusive fragrance of lavender and old paper that seemed to cling to her, to the very air around her. He began to crave her presence with an intensity that surprised him, the quiet hours spent in her company becoming the only moments of real peace in his otherwise turbulent existence. The physical distance between them began to shrink, the small book-strewn space of the shop becoming a world of its own, charged with an unspoken magnetic energy. A lingering touch as they reached for the same volume, a shared glance that lasted a moment too long, the soft brush of her arm against his as she poured their tea. The air between them crackled with a quiet, insistent hum, a silent symphony of unspoken desire. One evening, as the rain beat a steady rhythm against the windows, he found himself standing before a shelf of English poetry, a book of Keats in his hands. He turned to find her standing close behind him, her presence a warm, solid reality in the dimly lit aisle. "I feel more at peace here with you than I have in years," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he could not quite name. "It's like you're the quiet I've been searching for." She looked up at him, her eyes dark pools of sorrow and something else, something that made his heart beat a little faster. She did not speak, but he could see the answer in her gaze, the silent acknowledgement of the truth that lay between them. He could feel the pull of her, the irresistible gravity of her quiet strength, her gentle, wounded spirit. He wanted to close the small space that separated them, to take her in his arms and hold her, to offer what little comfort he could. But he was afraid of the depth of his own feelings, of the fragile, tentative hope that was beginning to take root in the barren landscape of his heart. He had come to Paris a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of the man he had once been. But in the quiet, dusty corners of a small bookshop, in the gentle, unassuming presence of a woman who understood the language of sorrow, he was beginning slowly, tentatively to feel alive again. He was beginning to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not a betrayal to love again, but a coming home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope that felt unnervingly foreign, in the familiar book-scented air of the shop. It was from his commanding officer, the words stark and unforgiving against the page. His orders. He was to return to America. The war was over, his duty done. He was to be discharged, sent home to a life he no longer recognized, a world that felt as distant and unreal as a half-forgotten dream. He read the letter twice, the words blurring before his eyes, a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of his stomach. He had known this day would come, had known that his time in Paris, his time with Elodie, was a temporary reprieve, a fragile, borrowed peace. But the reality of it, the stark finality of the words on the page, was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him feeling hollow and exposed. He looked across the shop at Elodie, who was arranging a display of leather-bound volumes in the window, her movements filled with their usual quiet grace. The late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in days streamed through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden halo around her dark hair. She was so beautiful, so achingly familiar, a part of him, of the quiet, ordered world he had come to crave. How could he leave her? How could he return to the loud, empty spaces of his former life, a life that no longer held any meaning for him. The news fell between them like a stone, sinking into the quiet depths of their shared world and sending ripples of unspoken anxiety out to the very edges. He watched as the light seemed to drain from her face, her eyes growing distant, her smile, always so fragile, disappearing altogether. She did not cry, did not rage against the injustice of it. She simply withdrew, retreating into the silent, sorrowful fortress of her grief, a place he could not follow. The easy intimacy they had shared, the comfortable silence that had been their language, was replaced by a strained, palpable tension. The air in the small shop, once so warm and inviting, grew thick with unspoken fears, with the words they could not bring themselves to say. He wanted to tell her that he would not go, that he would find a way to stay, to build a life with her in this city of ghosts and memories. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his own uncertainty, by the sudden, terrifying realization that he had nothing to offer her but his own brokenness. He tried to draw her out, to breach the walls she had erected around herself, but his efforts were met with a quiet, unyielding resistance. She would answer his questions with polite, monosyllabic replies, her eyes focused on some distant point beyond his shoulder. The evenings that had been their sanctuary became a form of exquisite torture. The silence between them no longer a comfort, but a vast, empty chasm. He began to see her only in glimpses, her face a pale, fleeting image in the crowded streets of Paris. He would catch sight of her walking along the Seine, her figure small and solitary against the grand, indifferent backdrop of the city, and a wave of such profound and helpless longing would wash over him that it left him breathless. He would call her name, but the wind would snatch the sound from his lips, and she would walk on, oblivious, disappearing into the anonymous crowds. He grew desperate, the days slipping by with an agonizing slowness, each one bringing him closer to the date of his departure. He began to haunt the places he knew she frequented, the small cafes where she would sometimes take her morning coffee, the quiet parks where she would walk in the afternoons. He would sit for hours nursing a single drink, his eyes scanning the faces of the passers-by, searching for the one face that had come to mean more to him than any other. He found her one afternoon in the Jardin du Luxembourg, sitting on a bench beneath the skeletal branches of a chestnut tree, a book lying open and unread in her lap. She was staring at the grey churning waters of the fountain, her expression one of such profound and desolate sorrow that it stopped his heart. He sat down beside her, his own grief a pale reflection of the anguish he saw in her eyes. "I thought what we had was real," he said, his voice rough with a pain he could no longer conceal. "But you're pushing me away. Is this all just a game to you?" She turned to him then, her eyes dark with a torment he could not begin to comprehend. "A game," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You think this is a game?" "What else am I to think?" he cried, his own carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "You won't talk to me. You won't look at me. It's as if I'm already gone." "Perhaps it would be better if you were," she said, her voice so low he could barely hear her over the mournful sigh of the wind. "Be better for you to leave, to forget you ever knew me." Her words were a slap in the face, a cold, cruel dismissal that left him reeling. He stared at her, his mind struggling to make sense of the sudden, inexplicable shift in her, the cold, hard wall that had risen between them. He did not know that her withdrawal was born of a terrible fear, the fear of loving a man again only to lose him. He did not know that looking at him, a soldier in a foreign land, she saw the ghost of her husband and the spectre of another unbearable loss. In pushing Thomas away, she was trying to protect her own shattered heart from breaking all over again. All he knew was the pain of her rejection, the sharp, bitter sting of her words. He rose to his feet, his own heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, He turned and walked away, not looking back, the taste of bitter coffee and unspoken fears a poison on his tongue. The cold, impersonal streets of Paris seemed to mock him, the stark white of the letter in his pocket a constant taunting reminder of the life he was being forced to return to, a life that now felt like a prison. The bookshop, once his sanctuary, was now a place of silence and sorrow, the quiet that had once soothed him now a deafening roar. He was adrift again, lost in a sea of grief and confusion, the fragile spark of hope that had been kindled in the darkness now extinguished, leaving him more alone than he had ever been before. The day of his departure arrived, a grey, sullen morning that mirrored the bleak landscape of his heart. He had not seen her, not spoken to her, since their painful, truncated conversation in the park. He had gone to the bookshop once the day before, but the door had been locked, a small handwritten sign in the window announcing that it was closed. He had stood there for a long time, staring at the darkened windows, a sense of finality settling over him like a shroud. He could not leave like this. He could not leave with the bitter taste of her rejection in his mouth, with the unanswered questions hanging between them like a thick, suffocating fog. He had to see her one last time, to understand, to hear the truth from her own lips, no matter how painful it might be. He found her in a small, secluded park at the edge of the city, a place of tangled, overgrown gardens and crumbling stone benches. She was standing beneath a gnarled, ancient oak, its bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the bruised, purple sky. The first drops of a cold, persistent rain had begun to fall, and she had not even seemed to notice, her face upturned to the heavens, her expression one of utter, desolate despair. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the damp, leaf-strewn ground. She did not turn as he approached, did not seem to be aware of his presence until he was standing directly in front of her. "I couldn't leave without seeing you," he said, his voice low and steady, belying the tremor in his hands. "I don't care about your past, Elodie. I only care about you." His words seemed to break through the shell of her sorrow, her carefully constructed defences crumbling before the simple, unadorned truth of his declaration. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, followed by another and another, until she was sobbing great, wrenching sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "You can't stay, you can't love me." "Why not?" he asked, his heart aching with a love so fierce, so protective that it threatened to consume him. "Tell me why." And so she told him the truth about Antoine. He had been part of the resistance, a quiet hero who used the bookshop as a drop point for messages. He was a poet, not a soldier, but he had fought for France in the only way he knew how. One evening he was caught. Someone had talked. The Gestapo came for him in the night, dragging him from their bed. She never saw him again. They sent her his wedding ring a month later, nothing more. "He was everything to me," she whispered, her voice choked with a grief that was still as raw as an open wound. "And they took him, just like that. How can I love you, a soldier so far from home? Knowing that you could be taken from me too? I cannot survive that again. It is better to be alone." She fell silent then, her confession hanging in the cold, damp air between them. He looked at her, at the beautiful, tormented face, at the eyes that were drowning in a sea of grief and fear, and he felt a wave of such profound and overwhelming love for her that it left him breathless. He did not see a woman pushing him away. He saw a woman terrified of being left behind. He was shaken, yes, but his love for her was a fierce, unwavering flame in the darkness, a love that was stronger than her fear, stronger than the ghosts of their shared past. He knew in that moment, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not leave her. He would not. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle, but filled with a raw, aching need, a desperate attempt to erase the pain from her face to silence the demons that whispered in her ear. His hands tangled in her rain-soaked hair, her fingers clutching at the rough fabric of his uniform. It was a kiss of reassurance, of shared sorrow, a silent, fervent promise that he would not leave her, that he would not let her face the darkness alone. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. His hands traced the curve of her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. He could feel the rough bark of the tree against her back, the cool, damp press of her clothes against his skin. The scent of rain and wet earth filled his senses, mingling with the salt of her tears on his lips. He was drowning in her, in the raw, unvarnished truth of her, and he knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he had found his home. He had come to Paris a soldier, a man haunted by the ghosts of war. But in the arms of this broken, beautiful woman, he had found a reason to stay, a reason to fight for a future he had not believed was possible. He had chosen love over duty, had chosen to remain in this city of shadows and secrets, to build a new life from the ashes of the old. He had chosen her, and in that choice he had finally, truly come home. The decision once made settled in his soul with the quiet, irrefutable weight of truth. He would not be returning to America, he would not be returning to the life that no longer felt like his own. He had found his home here, in the rain-slicked streets of Paris, in the quiet, dusty corners of a small bookshop, in the arms of a woman who had shown him the true meaning of courage. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, tentative hope, a sense of new beginnings. The bookshop, once a symbol of Elodie's past, of the life she had lost, became a symbol of their shared future, a sanctuary where they could begin to rebuild, not just their own lives, but the world around them. The morning sun, streaming through the newly washed windows, seemed to carry with it the promise of a brighter day, the scent of fresh-baked bread from the bakery next door, a reminder of the simple, enduring pleasures of life. They talked of the future, of a life together, their plans a fragile, beautiful tapestry woven from threads of hope and love. They would keep the shop, of course, its book-lined walls a testament to the enduring power of stories, of words, to heal and to connect. They would fill its shelves with new voices, with tales of survival and resilience, of love and loss and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. The ghosts of the past had not disappeared, but their power had begun to wane, their mournful whispers fading into the background, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared life. He still woke sometimes in the dead of night, the echoes of the battlefield ringing in his ears, but now, when he reached out in the darkness, he found her there, her warm, solid presence a steady anchor in the storm. Later that night, in the small, simple apartment above the bookshop, they came together again. This time there was no desperation, no raw, aching need, only a deep, abiding love that flowed between them like a quiet, steady river. He undressed her slowly, his touch a gentle, reverent exploration of the body he was coming to know, as well as his own. He kissed the scars on her soul, the places where she had been wounded, where the world had left its mark, and in his touch she found a healing she had not thought possible. Their love-making was a quiet celebration, a testament to their survival, a silent, fervent promise of the life they would build together. There were no words, only the language of touch, of skin against skin, of the shared, shuddering breaths that were a testament to the profound, ineffable connection that bound them, one to the other. Afterwards they lay tangled in the soft, worn sheets, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable, shared space, filled with the unspoken truths of their hearts. He had been a soldier, a man defined by war, by the things he had seen, the things he had done. She had been a widow, a woman defined by loss, by the ghost of a love that had been stolen from her. But together, in the quiet corners of a war-torn world, they had found a new definition, a new beginning. They had found their peace, not in the grand gestures of heroes, not in the empty promises of a world that was struggling to heal itself, but in the simple, profound courage of a love that chose to stay. And as he lay there, with her head resting on his chest, her soft, even breaths, a gentle rhythm against his skin, he knew that he was no longer a ghost. He was home. Whispers of the Bare Moon. The world of Isabel Rowe was one of muted colours and muffled sounds, a place of suffocating politeness. Her father, Judge Rowe, presided over their manicured estate with the same cold, unassailable logic he applied to his courtroom. It was a world of clipped hedges, of cold marble that seemed to leach the warmth from one's skin, and of whispered judgments that hung in the air like dust motes in the autumn light. Today, at an outdoor luncheon that felt more like a tribunal than a celebration, Isabel was the prize exhibit. Dressed in a gown the colour of a pale sky, she was a perfect porcelain doll, placed just so, her discomfort a fine, invisible crack in her composure. Her father was holding forth, his voice a smooth, confident baritone discussing his recent legal victory over the local tribe's land claims. He spoke of progress, of economic necessity, of the unimpeachable power of the law he represented. He dismissed the tribe's centuries of history with the wave of a hand, as one might dismiss a fly. "Sentimental nonsense," he declared to the nodding heads round the table. "You cannot halt the march of progress for the sake of a few old superstitions." Isabel felt a familiar nausea rise in her throat. She picked at the lace on her sleeve, the threads catching on her manicured nails. His world was a cage, and its bars were forged from his certainty. Later, seeking a moment's respite, she slipped away from the drone of conversation and walked toward the edge of the property, where the judge's immaculate lawn gave way to the unruly chaos of the forest. The air here was different, carrying on it a scent she couldn't name, something wild and mournful. A few steps further, and the scent became acrid, the sharp tang of smoke and grief. She saw it then, the edge of the burnt lands, a scar of black and grey against the vibrant golds and reds of the late autumn woods. It was the land her father's victory had condemned. She was so absorbed in the desolate beauty of the scene that she didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next a hand was over her mouth, and a hard, warm body was pressed against her back. A scream died in her throat, smothered by a calloused palm that smelled of earth and ash. She struggled, her heels digging uselessly into the soft turf, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The arm around her waist was unyielding, yet it held her with a surprising firm gentleness. There was no brutality in the touch, only an inexorable strength. He moved with a silence that was terrifying, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. He was a shadow, a phantom of the woods she had been taught to fear. He carried her deeper into the smouldering forest, away from the manicured lawns and the sound of her father's voice. The devastation was immense, a cathedral of ancient trees reduced to blackened skeletons. The ground was a carpet of grey ash that puffed up around his moccasined feet. The sharp, clean scent of her lavender perfume felt like a violation here, a shrill note in a symphony of sorrow. He finally set her down in a small unburnt clearing, though he did not release her arm. He was tall, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes that held the deep, quiet wisdom of the forest itself. His face was stark, carved from granite and sorrow, and his clothes were simple deerskin, stained with soot. He did not look at her like a prisoner, but like a burden he had been forced to carry. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze missing nothing. "I am a Hyoka." His voice was low and resonant, like the thrum of a distant drum. He finally released her arm, and she instinctively clutched the cold, smooth silver of the locket at her neck, its weight a familiar anchor in this terrifying new world. Inside was a miniature of her father's face, smiling and sure. "My father's council," a Hyoka began, his voice devoid of emotion, "decreed that the judge's daughter should be taken, that your life should be given in payment for this." He gestured to the charred remains of the forest around them. "They sent me to kill you." Isabel's blood ran cold. She could feel the frantic thud of her own heart against her ribs. But he had not killed her. He had brought her here, to the heart of his people's pain. "I disobeyed," he said simply. He looked away from her, toward the ruin of a great oak, its branches like skeletal arms raised in supplication. "My father is Howling Wolf. He believes in a law of blood for blood. I follow a different law, one that whispers from the earth itself. It told me to find you." "Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." A Hyoka turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time she saw something other than sorrow in his eyes. It was a profound, weary conflict. "You cannot go back. To my people you are a ghost, an emblem of their pain. Your father's world sees you as a victim to be avenged, and my father's world sees you as a debt to be paid. There is no place for you now." "What do you mean?" she cried, panic rising like a tide within her. He stepped closer, and his presence was overwhelming, elemental. "I have disobeyed my father. I have brought you here, into the heart of the wound. The council will not harbour you. They will see your white skin and hear your father's words in every breath you take." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face as if seeking something he wasn't sure he would find. "There is only one path I can see, one way to grant you sanctuary." She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "You must agree to be presented as my spirit-bonded bride," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "A woman brought to me by a vision. The lie must be so strong it becomes a truth. Only a sacred designation, a bond blessed by the spirits, will protect you from my father's law." Isabel stared at him, aghast. It was madness, a lie upon a lie. And yet, looking into his steady, solemn gaze, she saw no other choice. She was trapped between two worlds, and this strange, silent man was offering her the only bridge. She thought of his hands stained with soot and earth, yet holding her with a strange reverence, as if she were not a captive, but a prophecy he was reluctant to fulfill. She gave a single shaky nod. The first whisper of the bare moon had been spoken, and her old world had already turned to ash. A Hyoka's dwelling was not a cage, but a sanctuary. Built into the side of a hill overlooking a misty valley, the cabin was simple and sturdy, crafted from the forest itself. It was a world away from the cold marble and suffocating damask of her father's house. Here the air was warm and smelled of cedar, of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, of beeswax from the candles that cast a soft golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. The tone of their days was one of quiet observation, of a slowly thawing fear. The lie began the moment they arrived. He presented her to the few hunters and trappers they encountered on the paths near his home. He spoke in his native tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels, and though she could not understand the words, she understood their weight. He spoke of her with a solemn gravity that made the falsehood feel true. She felt the eyes of his people on her, saw their suspicion in the tightness of their mouths, but she also saw their deference to him, to the shamanic blood that ran in his veins. She was the spirit bride, a creature of vision, and so she was treated with a cautious, fearful respect. He began to teach her, not with lectures and books, but with his hands and his silence. He taught her the new language of this world, a language spoken by the wind in the pines and the cry of the hawk. He showed her how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to listen to the chatter of the birds for warnings of an approaching storm or a predator. When she sliced her hand open while clumsily trying to chop vegetables, he said nothing of her foolishness. Instead, he led her into the woods, his long fingers gently guiding her to a patch of feathery green leaves. Yarrow. He crushed them into a poultice, his touch on her skin, impersonal yet deeply, shockingly intimate, and bound the wound with a strip of clean linen. The sting of the cut was nothing compared to the jolt that shot through her at the brief, practiced touch of his fingers against hers. They lived in a shared solitude, two ghosts haunting the edge of a broken world. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the valley was immense, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. In those long hours, Isabel would lie awake, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of him, of wood smoke and pine, and listen to the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the small room. She would think of her father, of the life that had been stolen from her, and a wave of grief and rage would wash over her. But then she would think of Ahioka, of the quiet dignity with which he moved, the gentle patience of his teachings, and a different, more confusing emotion would take its place. One night, as they sat by the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you an exile?" He was silent for a long time, feeding sticks into the fire. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the burning wood. "When I was a boy," he said at last, his voice a low murmur, "I had a vision. I saw the Great Bear Spirit, the mother of our people, weeping as the forest burned. I told my father, and he saw it as a sign of weakness. He said a warrior's spirit should be filled with rage at the fire, not sorrow. He said my heart was too soft, that I felt the pain of the earth too deeply to be a leader of men." He poked at the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "He has not looked at me the same since. I was marked as different. It is better that I live on the periphery." In his words, Isabel heard an echo of her own life. She too had been marked as different, her own quiet, introspective nature a disappointment to her powerful, pragmatic father. "I had been taught to fear the wild, to see it as a thing to be conquered," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. "But living with you, I began to understand it was not wildness I had feared, but freedom." He looked up at her then, and the space between them crackled with a sudden intense connection. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the judge's daughter, not as a spirit bride, but as another soul living on the periphery. Her perception of him shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. She began to see past her fear, past the strangeness of her situation. She watched the way he moved, with an economy of motion that was both powerful and graceful, like a panther. She listened to the cadence of his voice when he spoke the names of the plants and the stars, a soft poetry that made her own language feel harsh and clumsy. She ate the rabbit stew he cooked over the fire, smoky and rich, and felt a nourishment that went deeper than her bones. One evening he pointed to the full silver orb rising over the valley. "The bare moon," he said. It was under the light of that same moon that he had taken her, and under its light that she was being reborn. The ruse of being his bride began to feel less like a performance and more like a strange, unsettling truth taking root in her soul. She would catch him looking at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he would turn away. The rough texture of the wool blanket he had given her, the intricate patterns of the beadwork on his moccasins, the steady, quiet presence of him in the small cabin, these were the anchors of her new reality. In her old home, she had 1,000 books that spoke of truth. but none of them had taught her the name of a single flower, or the feel of the earth breathing beneath her feet. The summons came on a morning when the air was sharp with the promise of winter. A young boy from the village, his face a mask of solemn duty, arrived with a message for Ahioka. He was to present himself before his father, Howling Wolf, and the Council of Elders. Ahioka's jaw tightened as he listened to the boy's message, his eyes dark with a familiar weary pain. He was reluctant to leave Isabel, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low. "Do not leave the cabin. You will be safe here." But as she watched him disappear down the winding path, his broad back straight and proud, a new and unfamiliar emotion took root in her heart. It was not fear for herself, but for him. She had been a passive creature her entire life, a doll to be arranged and admired. But something had shifted within her in this small, quiet cabin. She was no longer just the judge's daughter. She was Ahioka's spirit bride, and the lie had become her shield, her identity. And now, the man who'd given her that shield was walking into the heart of the danger that she had brought upon him. Driven by a mixture of dread and a fierce, nascent protectiveness, she disobeyed him. She wrapped herself in a dark cloak and followed him at a distance, her city-bred clumsiness making her feel like a charging bull in his silent world. She moved from tree to tree, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs until she reached the edge of the tribal village. It was a collection of modest wooden structures, nestled in a deep, protected cove of the forest. The air here was different from the peaceful solitude of Ahioka's valley. It was tense, heavy with unspoken grief and suspicion. The smoke from a central council fire hung thick and acrid in the air, casting long, wavering shadows that felt accusatory. It was a scene of Bronte-esque Gothic tension, a place of secrets and simmering resentments. Isabel hid in the shadows at the edge of the council circle, her face pale, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw Ahioka standing before a group of older men, his face impassive. At their centre sat an older man with a face like a weathered stone, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. This, she knew, was Howling Wolf. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice a harsh, guttural torrent of rage. The words were alien to her, but their meaning was brutally clear. He did not believe in the spirit bride. He saw her as a white devil, a poison brought into their midst. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at his son. "You bring this ghost into our sacred places and call it destiny. I call it treason. Her skin is the colour of the ash that covers our hunting grounds." Isabel flinched as if struck. The venom in his voice was a physical thing, a poison that seeped into her very bones. She saw the faces of the other elders, saw the doubt and suspicion warring with their respect for Ahioka's spiritual authority. Ahioka stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He met his father's fury with a quiet, unshakable dignity, his own words a calm, steady river against the storm of his father's rage. He spoke of his vision, of the whispers of the earth, of a law that was older and deeper than the law of vengeance. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The wound was too raw, the grief too fresh. How could they trust a vision that brought the daughter of their enemy into their heart? The council ended with no resolution, the tension hanging in the air like an unsheathed blade. Ahioka turned and walked away, his jaw tight with a pain that was more than just the sting of his father's words. It was the pain of a man torn between his people and his soul. He found her on the path back to the cabin. She had not meant for him to see her, but she had been unable to move, frozen by the terrible scene she had just witnessed. He stopped, his dark eyes meeting hers, and the fragile peace that had grown between them in the quiet solitude of the cabin was shattered. The weight of the real world, of his father's hatred and her father's sins, came crashing down upon them. "You followed me," he said, his voice flat. "I was afraid for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your fear does not help." The words were harsh, clipped. "Your presence here, it is a fire that will consume us both." In that moment, hearing the venom in his father's voice, she was no longer a judge's daughter. She was the weapon being used against the only man who had shown her mercy. My safety was his ruin. The cold dread that had been coiling in her stomach now felt like a block of ice. The lie that had been their shield was now the very thing that would destroy them. He did not speak another word. He simply grabbed her hand, his grip hard and urgent, and pulled her off the path. He moved with a desperate primal urgency, not back toward the fragile safety of the cabin, but deeper into the wild, into the heart of the ancient forest. The world became a blur of green and brown, the slap of branches against her face, the burn of her lungs as she struggled to keep up with his long, silent strides. They finally stopped before a thundering curtain of water, a powerful waterfall that crashed into a deep crystalline pool below. The roar was deafening, a raw elemental sound that drowned out the world. The last light of the day was fading, but the full silver disk of the bare moon was rising, its light casting an ethereal glow on the mist that rose from the falls. Without a word, he pulled her forward, through the cold, shocking curtain of water, and into the secret space that lay behind it. They were in a grotto, a hidden, sacred place. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Shafts of moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the small cavern in a painterly chiaroscuro of silver and shadow. They stood there, shivering and soaked, the roar of the waterfall creating a world out of time, a sanctuary from the hatred and fear that lay just beyond the veil of water. And then the tension that had been stretched taut between them finally snapped. "My vision," he began, his voice raw, ragged, barely audible above the thunder of the falls. "The weeping bear was not my only one." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity in the dim light. Water dripped from his black hair, tracing the hard lines of his face. "For years I have dreamt of you. A woman with a pale face and eyes the colour of a winter sky. I heard your voice in my dreams, though I did not understand the words. I saw your fear, your loneliness." He took a step closer, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently brushing the wet skin of her cheeks. "I did not save you out of mercy alone, Isabel. I saved you because my spirit has always known you. I saved you because you were the other half of my own soul." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful, more binding than any lie they had ever told. The walls between them, captor and captive, his world and hers, the lie they had built and the truth he had just revealed, crumbled into dust. In that moment she understood. The ruse had to become real. Not for the council, not for his father, but for them. It was the only way. He kissed her then, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry release of all the fear and longing that had coiled in the silence between them. His mouth was hard and demanding on hers, and she met his hunger without hesitation, a wildness she hadn't known she possessed surging through her veins. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer as a low sound, half sob, half moan, tore from her throat. The world narrowed to the thunder of the waterfall and the frantic beat of their hearts. His hands, usually so careful and restrained, were now instruments of exquisite discovery. He didn't rip her wet clothes away. The act was far more deliberate, a slow, sacred unveiling that was its own form of torment. His fingers worked the buttons of her tunic, each touch a spark against her cold, damp skin. The rough wool peeled away, exposing the pale skin of her shoulders and throat to the cool, misty air of the grotto. The contrast made her shiver, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The moonlight filtered through the curtain of water, painted the lines of her body in strokes of silver and shadow. Her fear had burned away, leaving in its place a profound, aching need that pooled hot and heavy deep inside her. This was a different kind of surrender, not of a captive, but of a soul to its missing half. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice a raw prayer against her skin, and then his hands began their worship. He traced the delicate line of her collarbone with one calloused finger, and a jolt of pure sensation shot through her, so intense it made her gasp. She felt utterly exposed, utterly seen, as his hands learned every curve, every secret hollow of her body. They slid down her ribs, exploring the gentle flare of her hips, the soft plane of her stomach. She felt her muscles quiver and contract under his touch. No one had ever touched her like this, with such reverent hunger, as if he were memorizing her with his fingertips. A whimper escaped her lips. Her own hands, clumsy with a desperate need, worked at the ties of his clothes until they fell away. He was beautiful, a creature of earth and moonlight, his skin gleaming with the mist of the falls. He laid her back against the cold, smooth stone of the grotto wall. The shock of the cold was a stark, electrifying contrast to the fire of his skin against hers. His mouth replaced his hands, tasting the salt and river water from her skin. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the frantic pulse he found there, then moved lower, his lips tracing a hot path over her skin that made her arch her back in a silent plea. Isabel's head fell back against the stone, her eyes fluttering closed as she gave herself over to the symphony of sensation. He rose over her, and she felt the heat of his body, the promise of a deeper connection. He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers, a silent question passing between them. She answered by reaching for him, pulling him down, a silent yes that echoed in the roaring chamber. When their bodies finally joined, it was a slow, deep union that stole her breath and filled a void she never knew she had. It was a claiming, a deliberate, sacred act that sealed their fates together. For a moment, he remained still, letting her body adjust to the glorious, overwhelming closeness of him. Then he began to move. It was a primal, powerful rhythm, a dance of shadow and light in the secret heart of the world. Her own soft, breathless moans merged with the thunder of the water. The feeling of the cold stone against her back grounded her as he took her higher, their movements becoming more urgent. He was not just touching her body, he was touching her soul, and she was giving it freely, joyfully. The pleasure built within her, a searing, unbearable heat that coiled tighter and tighter until she thought she would shatter. The climax was a shared, shuddering wave, a violent, beautiful tearing away of the veil. A hoarse cry was torn from his throat, and her own release was a blinding flash of white light behind her eyes as she called his name into the roaring darkness. In the echoing silence that followed, broken only by the eternal pulse of the waterfall, they clung to each other, their bodies still trembling from the force of their connection. He collapsed against her, his forehead resting on hers, their breath mingling in the cool, misty air. Two souls, once broken and lost, now forged into one in the heart of the bare moon's secret sanctuary. Dawn broke over the forest, the light soft and forgiving, the mist rising from the damp earth like the ghosts of the night's passions. Word had travelled, carried on the wind, or by unseen messengers. Her father had come. They met in a neutral clearing at the edge of the forest, a place that belonged to neither world. Judge Rowe was flanked by a small party of armed men, his face a mask of grim determination. Opposite them stood Howling Wolf and the tribal elders, their faces equally hard and unyielding. It was a standoff, a silent war of wills between two worlds that had only ever known conflict. But then a new figure stepped into the space between them. It was Isabel, with a Hioka at her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She was no longer the fragile porcelain doll who had been taken from the edge of the manicured lawn. She stood tall and straight, her fine silk gown replaced by practical deerskin leggings and a simple tunic. Her hair was no longer in an elaborate coiffure, but in a single thick braid, woven with a single hawk's feather that a yoker had given her. She looked at her father, her heart aching with a love that was now tempered by a new, unshakable strength. "Father," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "I was not harmed. I was saved." She became the bridge. She turned to Howling Wolf and spoke, not in his tongue, but in the language of her heart, a language of respect and understanding. She spoke of her own captivity in her father's world, of the freedom she had found in the heart of the forest. And then she began to translate, her voice the calm, steady link between the two proud, stubborn men. She translated her father's fear into a language of parental love, and she translated Howling Wolf's grief into a language of a people's pain. Finally, she turned back to her father. "I am not coming home," she said, the words both a declaration and a plea. "Because I am home." She took Ahioka's hand in hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of simple, profound unity. "My place is here, with him." Judge Rowe looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time, not as an extension of his own ambition, but as a woman. He saw the strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she stood, no longer bowed by the weight of his expectations. He saw the fierce, protective love in Ahioka's eyes as he looked at her, and in that moment, the judge's cold, logical world cracked. He could not fight this. He could not win this, because this was not a battle to be won, but a truth to be accepted. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of relinquishment. He was not giving his daughter to a captor, but to a life she had freely chosen. Before he left, he ordered his men to leave a crate of supplies, blankets, salted meat, medicine, a silent, grudging gesture of peace. Isabel and Ahioka walked back to their cabin hand in hand, the world quiet and still around them. The threat had passed. The war was over. As they entered the small warm space, Isabel walked to a small wooden chest where she had kept her few remaining possessions from her old life. She took the silver locket from around her neck, its cold weight so familiar against her skin. She opened it one last time, looked at the smiling, confident face of her father, and then she closed it, the click of the clasp a final, definitive sound. She placed the locket in the box and closed the lid. It was her final act of liberation. That night, they lay together before their fire, its warm golden light flickering on their skin. A profound and knowing tenderness settled between them, a quiet language spoken not with words, but with the soft sounds of breath and the gentle crackle of the hearth. This was the peaceful certainty that follows a storm, a deep and settled calm. He kissed her with a slow, lingering reverence, each touch of his lips a silent promise. His hands moved over her to soothe and reassure, learning the new landscape of her body, which was now irrevocably his. Their closeness was a silent vow, the slow, deliberate building of a life in the small, sacred space of their home. It was firelight and whispered truths, the profound, unshakable intimacy of a shared future. He held her, his arm a comfortable, familiar weight around her, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against her back. And as she drifted off to sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had been her captor, her saviour, her destiny, she finally understood. A home was not four walls, but the space carved out in another soul. In the heart of the wild, surrounded by the whispers of the bare moon, she had not been captured, but finally, irrevocably set free. the Duchess of Great Jones Street. The heat in Mrs. Astor's ballroom on Great Jones Street was a physical presence. A thick, suffocating blanket woven from the scent of wilting magnolias, expensive French perfume, and the collective anxious breath of New York's striving elite. It clung to the damask curtains and rosewood furniture, settled in the folds of silk gowns, and beaded on the brows of men whose starched collars had begun to lose their resolve. Julian Ashcroft, however, remained impeccable. He stood near a marble column, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his posture a study in calculated ease. Inside, his mind was a whirlwind of strategic calculation. He was a southerner, a man from Savannah, with a past he kept carefully folded away, armed with little more than a sharp legal mind and a hunger so immense it felt like a hollow ache in his chest. He had come to this city of industry and inherited wealth to conquer it, to carve his name into its stony heart until the whispers of his modest origins were silenced by the roar of his success. Tonight was a battlefield, and every smile, every nod, every carefully chosen word was a move in a campaign he could not afford to lose. He watched the dancers spin under the gaslight chandeliers, a dizzying carousel of jewels and ambition. The rhythm of the waltz was the seductive heartbeat of this world, a world he both coveted and despised. It was a gilded cage, and he was determined to become one of its keepers. Then she appeared, and the rhythm of the room seemed to falter. Eleanor Pembroke. They called her the Duchess of Great Jones Street, a title bestowed with a mixture of admiration and mockery. She was not a confection of lace and simpering smiles. Her gown of deep sapphire silk was elegant but severe, her dark hair coiled in a simple regal knot at the nape of her neck. It was her posture that arrested him, the straightness of her spine, the directness of her gaze. She did not drift through the crowd, she navigated it. As she passed a knot of gossiping matrons, Julian heard one of them, Mrs. van der Luyden, make a cloying comment about the new railway bonds. Eleanor's response, clear and cool, cut through the humid air. "Indeed, Mrs. van der Luyden. It seems we are now measuring progress by how swiftly we can flee the city we pretend to adore." The matrons blinked, their fans fluttering in confused agitation. Julian felt a smile touch his lips, a genuine one, for the first time that evening. It was a sentiment he had harboured himself, a shard of truth in a mountain of glittering artifice. He felt an immediate magnetic pull, a curiosity that transcended strategy. She moved through this gilded cage as if she owned it, yet her eyes held the weary wisdom of a prisoner, he thought. I came to conquer this world, but in her I see a world I'd rather explore. Emboldened by a reckless impulse that momentarily overrode his caution, he moved toward her. She was examining a painting, a rather sentimental landscape of the Hudson River. Her expression was one of polite indifference. A rather tame depiction of a wild river, wouldn't you agree, Miss Pembroke? He said, his voice a low counterpoint to the music. She turned, and her eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, met his. There was no surprise in them, only assessment. "Mr. Ashcroft, I am surprised to find a man of law so interested in the aesthetics of landscape." "A lawyer must understand the nature of things, Miss Pembroke, both wild and tame." He gave her a slight bow. "The waltz is beginning. May I have the honour?" She hesitated for a beat, her gaze sweeping over him, taking in the perfect cut of his coat, the ambition burning like a low fever in his eyes. He expected a polite refusal. Instead, a flicker of something, challenge perhaps, sparked in her expression. "Very well, Mr. Ashcroft, but I must warn you, I prefer a partner who can lead without stumbling." He led her to the floor, his hand resting on the small of her back, the silk of her gown warm beneath his palm. They moved together with a surprising fluidity, two sets of calculations aligning in perfect time. The dance was a conversation in itself, a physical volley of wit and will. "You are new to our city's particular brand of enthusiasm," she said, her voice a murmur against the swell of the orchestra. "I am a student of it," he replied, guiding her through a turn. "I find it endlessly fascinating." "Do you? Or do you simply find it useful?" The question was a sharp, delicate probe. He was accustomed to the fawning flattery of young women hoping for a proposal, not this intellectual dissection. Usefulness is a form of fascination, he countered, just as beauty can be a form of power. Her eyes flashed. "You speak of ambition, Mr. Ashcroft, but is it your own? Or is it a tune composed by the men who own these houses?" He was so taken aback by her perception that he almost did stumble. She saw him, not the polished facade, but the machinery working beneath it. The scent of crushed gardenias on her wrist filled his senses, a heady, intoxicating fragrance that seemed both wild and refined, much like the woman herself. The waltz ended, leaving them breathless and flush with a tension that was more than just physical exertion. The heat of the room felt more oppressive than ever. "I find myself in need of air," Eleanor said, her fan moving in a sharp, impatient rhythm. "Allow me," Julian said, and without waiting for a response, he guided her through a set of French doors to a secluded balcony. The cool night air was a relief, a sudden baptism after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Below them, a walled garden lay in shadow, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine rising to meet them. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the distant music a muted thrum. Here, away from the prying eyes and the gilded pretense, their masks began to slip. "You despise it, don't you?" he said, his voice quiet. "This performance." She turned to face him, leaning back against the stone balustrade. The moonlight softened the severity of her features, revealing a vulnerability she kept carefully guarded. "I despise the cage," she corrected. "The bars are gold, the food is plentiful, but the view never changes." She looked at him, her gaze unnervingly direct. "And you, Mr. Ashcroft, what do you truly desire, beyond the approval of men who measure a man's worth by the vintage of his port?" The question disarmed him. No one had ever asked him that. No one had cared to look past the ambition to the man beneath. "I desire a life of substance," he admitted, the words feeling foreign and yet profoundly true on his tongue. "To build something that lasts. To not be forgotten." She nodded slowly, a sad sort of understanding in her eyes. "A legacy. I understand. My legacy is to be a prize, a beautiful object to be acquired and displayed. I would rather be the architect." In that moment, under the vast star-dusted sky, Julian felt a connection so profound it startled him. He saw past the Duchess, past the debutante, to the brilliant, yearning soul trapped within. He saw a partner, a mind that could challenge his own, a spirit that could match his fire. The conquest of New York society suddenly seemed a hollow, tawdry prize compared to the world he glimpsed in her eyes. The game had changed. He no longer wanted to win this world, he wanted to win her. Their courtship could not flourish in the stifling hothouse of Great Jones Street. Society had its rules, its rigid choreographies of calls and chaperone carriage rides, all conducted under the scrutinizing gaze of 1,000 eyes. A relationship born on a balcony in a moment of shared rebellion required a different soil in which to grow, and so they began to meet in secret. Their world became the quiet, forgotten corners of the city. They found a dusty, sun-drenched bookshop on a cobbled side street, a place that smelled of old paper, leather, and decaying glue. The proprietor, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, paid them no mind. Accustomed to lovers of all sorts seeking refuge amongst his silent, towering shelves. Here, surrounded by the thoughts of dead poets and radical philosophers, Eleanor was transformed. She was no longer the icy Duchess, but a woman alive with intellectual fervour. She would pull a volume from a high shelf, her eyes alight, and read a passage aloud, her voice a low, passionate hum that made the hairs on Julian's arm stand on end. He found himself drawn into her world, a world of ideas and heated debate that felt more real, more vital than any of the stilted conversations he endured in the drawing rooms of his patrons. He in turn began to shed his own armour. He spoke to her not of his legal triumphs, but of his fears. He confessed the weight of his family's expectations in Savannah, the genteel poverty he had fled, the gnawing, deep-seated fear of insignificance that drove him with a relentless whip. One cool, misty morning, they met at dawn in a public park. The city was still asleep, the air tasting of damp earth and the coming day. They bought sweet red strawberries from a street vendor, their fingers brushing as he passed her the paper cone. The simple intimacy of the act, the taste of the fruit on his tongue, was more potent than any carefully orchestrated social ritual. He fears being unseen, Eleanor thought, watching him as he stared out over the fog-shrouded pond. It is the same fear I have, only mine is of being seen for the wrong reasons. Perhaps we are two sides of the same tarnished coin. That afternoon Julian found himself drawn back to the bookshop alone. He purchased a slim, controversial volume of poetry by a new radical author, a book no respectable woman would be permitted to own. It was a declaration, a signal that he saw her, the real her, the architect trapped inside the prize. He brought it to her that evening, using the pretext of returning a misplaced glove to gain entrance to her family's grand, silent house. He found her in her private sitting room, a space that defied the Pembroke family's opulent aesthetic. It was a room of books, not embroidery hoops. Volumes were stacked on every available surface, their spines cracked, their pages filled with her own spidery annotations. It was her sanctuary, her rebellion. He presented the book to her. She took it, her breath catching as she read the title. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and luminous in the soft lamplight. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because I have been listening," he said softly. Their hands touched over the cover, a current of understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of their deepening bond. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken words, with the potent, terrifying intimacy of being truly seen. "With you," he confessed, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "The air is clearer. I feel I can finally breathe." She looked from the book to his face, her expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. He saw the walls she had so carefully constructed begin to crumble, and in their place a raw, aching vulnerability. He closed the small distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Her skin was like cool silk. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of demanding passion, not the kiss of a suitor claiming his prize. It was a kiss of profound recognition, of reverence. It was slow and gentle, a question and an answer in one. Her lips, at first hesitant, softened under his, parting with a sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of her lonely rebellion. He tasted the faint sweetness of tea and the sharper, more intoxicating flavour of her own unique essence. It was a kiss that promised not conquest, but sanctuary. A promise of what could be in a world of their own making, far from the gilded cage of Great Jones Street. The city's social season, relentless as the tide, pulled them back into its orbit. The quiet intimacy of the bookshop and the dawnlit park felt a world away, a half-remembered dream. Now the tone was menacing, claustrophobic. The air, once thick with perfume, was now thick with suspicion and the chill of impending ruin. A persistent autumn rain streaked the windows of carriages and grand houses, mirroring the turmoil that was brewing. The epicentre of their undoing was a masquerade ball, a lavish affair hosted by a family whose new money, was still in need of the polish of old associations. The masks, meant to be a playful conceit, instead provided a false sense of security, a shield for clandestine behaviour and whispered malice. Julian felt the familiar pressure settle on him as he entered the glittering ballroom, his carefully constructed ambition reasserting its claim. He had made progress. Influential men now sought his opinion, their daughters his attention. The prize was so close he could taste it. Eleanor was there, a silver mask concealing her features, but he would have known her anywhere by the proud set of her shoulders. She looked like a goddess of the hunt, Artemis trapped amongst mortals. Throughout the evening he was aware of her, a magnetic pole he tried and failed to ignore. He was also aware of another man, a powerful and persistent suitor named Alistair Finch, whose advances she had consistently and publicly rejected. Finch was a man of immense wealth and brutish charm, unaccustomed to being denied. Julian saw Finch corner her in a secluded alcove, partially hidden by a large potted fern. He saw the aggressive set of Finch's body, the way he loomed over her. Julian's instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he was trapped in a conversation with a senior law partner, a man whose patronage was crucial to his ascent. He told himself Eleanor could handle it. She was the Duchess, after all. He was wrong. In the shadows of the alcove, Finch, emboldened by wine and the anonymity of his mask, forcefully kissed her. It was an act of possession, a punishment for her defiance. Eleanor shoved him away, her body rigid with fury, her mask askew, but the damage was done. A rival of Eleanor's, a woman of saccharine sweetness and venomous envy, had seen it all. With a quiet, triumphant smile, she slipped away to ensure the moment was witnessed by the most influential gossips in the room. The story twisted as it travelled, gaining a life of its own. By the time it reached Julian, whispered behind a silk fan, Eleanor was no longer the victim but the perpetrator, a wanton woman of loose morals caught in a common tryst. "They call her the Duchess," one woman tittered, "but it seems her blood is not so blue. Caught like a common strumpet." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He looked across the room and saw the aftermath. He saw Eleanor standing alone, her mask now fully removed, her face pale and distressed. He saw Finch, preening amongst his friends. And worst of all, he saw his patrons, the architects of his future, watching him. Their expressions were cold, questioning. They were watching to see which side he would choose, the tarnished debutante or the world of power and acceptance she had so often scorned. His ambition, that ravenous beast he had fed for so long, reared its head and roared. His heart screamed for him to go to her, to stand by her side, to be the man he was in the quiet of her sitting room. But his mind, the sharp, strategic mind that had brought him this far, saw only the ruin. He saw the doors of influence slamming shut, the partnerships dissolving, the years of striving turning to dust. In a moment of devastating, soul-crushing self-preservation, he turned away. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head to his patron, a silent disavowal. Then he walked in the opposite direction, leaving Eleanor to face the whispers alone. The fallout was swift and brutal. Eleanor was ostracised. Invitations ceased. Carriages that once stopped at the Pembroke residence now hurried past. Her family, mortified and uncomprehending, retreated into a state of shocked seclusion. Julian, meanwhile, got everything he thought he wanted. He was praised for his sound judgment. He was invited to intimate dinners, to brandy-fueled backroom meetings where the real business of the city was conducted. He had won, but the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. The conversations were meaningless, the champagne tasted of bile. Every laugh felt like a betrayal. The silence from Eleanor was a deafening roar that filled every moment of his hollow triumph. He would stand at his window late at night, the relentless rain weeping against the glass, and see her face in the reflection. He saw her distress, her shock, her ultimate devastating realization that he, the man who'd promised her a clear air to breathe, had been the one to suffocate her. I sold my soul for a glass of champagne and a well-placed smile, he thought, the words a bitter litany in his mind, and the cost was her. The days that followed were a blur of hollow victories for Julian. He moved through the gilded world he had so desperately sought, a ghost at a feast. The weight of his cowardice was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. He was tormented by the memory of Eleanor's face in that moment of abandonment, the flash of disbelief, the chilling heartbreak in her eyes before her mask of icy indifference slammed back into place. The turning point came not in a grand ballroom, but in the smoky, leather-bound confines of his gentleman's club. He overheard Alistair Finch holding court by the fireplace, boasting of his conquest. Finch spoke of Eleanor with a casual proprietary cruelty, painting a lurid picture of a willing, even eager participant. He was stealing not only her reputation, but the truth of their connection, twisting it into something ugly and cheap. A white-hot rage, pure and cleansing, burned through Julian. It incinerated the carefully constructed walls of his ambition, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. He loved her. He loved her intelligence, her fire, her infuriating defiance, and he had sacrificed her for the approval of men he despised. In that moment, reputation be damned. His soul was not worth the price of their acceptance. He strode across the room, his movements so abrupt that conversations faltered. He stopped before Finch, his voice low and shaking with suppressed fury. "You're a liar, Finch, and a coward." The room fell silent. Finch, stunned, sputtered a denial. "Ashcroft, you're drunk." "I am painfully seared," Julian said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the haze of cigar smoke. "You will retract your slanderous statements about Miss Pembroke. You will apologise to her, and you will do it publicly, or I will see you ruined. I will use every ounce of legal knowledge I possess to dismantle your family's business, brick by rotten brick. Do you understand me?" It was social suicide. He was denouncing a powerful man, defending a fallen woman, and in doing so severing every connection he had so carefully cultivated. He felt the cold, judgmental eyes of his former patrons on him, but for the first time in months he felt clean. It was a rebirth. He left the club without a backward glance and stepped out into the night. A torrential rain was falling, a storm that mirrored the tempest in his soul. He didn't hail a carriage. He walked, letting the cold, driving rain soak him to the bone as if it could wash away the stain of his betrayal. He walked all the way to Great Jones Street, to the grand, silent Pembroke house. He had no idea if she would see him, if she would even open the door. He was prepared to stand on her doorstep all night, to beg, to lay his broken pride at her feet. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, harder. After a lifetime of waiting, the door opened a crack. A servant peered out, then, recognizing him, tried to shut it. "Please," Julian said, his voice raw. "Tell her I am here. Tell her I will not leave." He waited, rain dripping from his hair, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then the door swung open. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, her face pale and impassive in the dim light of the hall. She looked at his drenched, pathetic form, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the old fire in her eyes. "You have a great deal of nerve, Mr. Ashcroft," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I know," he croaked. "Let me in, Eleanor, please." She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. He dripped onto the marble floor of the grand foyer, a place he had once entered with such calculated confidence. She led him not to one of the formal receiving rooms, but to her sitting room, the sanctuary of books he had once breached with a gift of poetry. A small fire flickered in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with weeks of pain and longing. "What do you want?" she asked, her arms crossed, her body a fortress. "Forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking, "though I don't deserve it." And then the storm broke. The argument that erupted was a hurricane of accusations and confessions, of fury and betrayal. She threw his cowardice in his face, her voice rising with every carefully hoarded ounce of pain. He did not defend himself. He absorbed every word, every verbal blow, accepting it as his penance. "You left me there," she cried, her voice finally cracking, tears streaming down her face. "You watched them tear me apart and you walked away." "I know," he said, stepping closer, his own tears mixing with the rain on his face. "And I have been in hell every moment since, a hell of my own making. I chose the cage, Eleanor. I chose the cage over you, and it was the most damnable mistake of my life." His confession, his utter brokenness seemed to drain the anger from her, leaving a vacuum of raw, aching need in its place. The fury and pain had burned away all the artifice, all the masks, leaving only the two of them stripped bare and shivering in the ruins. He reached for her. His hands not gentle at first, but desperate, framing her face, his thumbs wiping at her tears. He looked at her as if memorizing every line, every freckle, as if he could erase the memory of his absence with the intensity of his gaze. The scent of rain on his coat mingled with the scent of her skin, a perfume of storm and sorrow. His mouth crashed down on hers. It was a bruising, desperate kiss, a clash of teeth and tongues, a battle for absolution. It was not a kiss of reverence. It was a kiss of raw, agonizing need. She resisted for a moment, her hands pushing against his chest, and then, with a sob, she surrendered, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. This was not a reunion. It was a claiming. His hands moved over her, frantic, tracing the lines of her neck, her shoulders, the curve of her back. He was relearning the geography of her, a land he had willingly abandoned and now desperately sought to reclaim. Clothes were not so much removed as torn away, a frantic shedding of propriety and pain and lonely nights. The buttons of her dress gave way under his fumbling fingers, his mouth leaving a trail of fire down her throat. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist, and pressed her against the cold, solid wall. Her gasp turned into a moan as he moved with her, a powerful, deliberate act of reclaiming their lost ground. There was no gentleness in it. Not yet. It was a staking of a claim on a future he had almost thrown away. Their bodies found a desperate, perfect rhythm, part apology, part worship. Every shared breath, every movement that brought them closer, was a wordless promise that settled deep within her soul. "I am here. I will not leave you again." Her body arched to meet his, her nails digging into the slick, tense muscles of his back, scoring the skin in a desperate attempt to pull him into deeper connection. The flickering firelight danced over their slick skin, casting them as pagan figures in some ancient rite of atonement and desire. Her release was a shattering cry that was both pleasure and catharsis, a sound that broke the last of his restraint. He followed her into the abyss, his own release a groan of utter, abject surrender. They slid down the wall to the floor, their bodies slick with sweat and rain and tears, their ragged breaths the only sound in the room besides the crackling fire and the dying storm outside. He held her, his heart pounding against hers, the taste of salt from her tears and her skin on his lips. He was home. The gilded cage of Great Jones Street was left behind, a relic of a life they no longer wanted. Julian, having committed social seppuku, found himself liberated. The prestigious connections vanished, but so did the crushing weight of expectation. He rented a small, unassuming office and began taking on cases for those without power or influence, immigrants, labourers, wronged women. He discovered a purpose deeper and more satisfying than the shallow pursuit of status. He found his power not in position, but in principle. Eleanor, free from the suffocating role of the Duchess, bloomed. She shed the last vestiges of her family's disapproval like a heavy cloak and revelled in her new life. She began to write, publishing essays under a male pseudonym that were praised for their sharp wit and radical insight. They rented a small but charming house in a less fashionable but welcoming neighbourhood, a place with a small garden and windows that let in the morning light. They were a team, partners in a life of their own design. Their new reality was built not on social standing, but on shared truths and quiet moments. One evening they hosted a small gathering. The guests were not the city's elite, but a motley collection of artists, writers, thinkers, and a few of Julian's grateful clients. The air buzzed not with gossip, but with passionate debate and easy laughter. It was a quiet declaration of their new values, a society of their own making. One morning they rose before dawn and walked as the city began to wake around them. The air was cool and crisp, tasting of possibility. They stopped on a small bridge overlooking the river, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. Julian took Eleanor's hand. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand declaration. He simply looked into her eyes, the stormy sea of them now calm and clear, and slid a simple, unadorned silver ring onto her finger. "This is not a claim," he said, his voice soft but sure. "It is a promise, a symbol of our partnership, of an equal union." She looked at the ring, then back at him, her smile more radiant than any jewel she had ever worn. "I know," she whispered, and kissed him. A sweet, lingering kiss that tasted of the morning and of home. They returned to their sun-drenched bedroom, the light pouring in through the open window, carrying the scent of coffee from the kitchen and the clean linens on their bed. Their lovemaking that morning was not the desperate, stormy passion of their reunion, but something else entirely, a profound, confident intimacy. It was the lovemaking of two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst, and had chosen each other completely, not in spite of their flaws, but because of them. It was imbued with a sense of safety, tenderness, and playful rediscovery. He undressed her slowly, his touch reverent, his gaze full of a love so deep it was almost painful to behold. His hands, which had once been desperate and claiming, were now slow and curious, worshipful. He kissed the curve of her shoulder, the hollow of her throat, the sensitive skin of her inner wrist where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against his lips. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her skin, the words a prayer. She, in turn, explored him with a new confidence, her hands tracing the hard planes of his chest, her soft kisses lingering in gratitude. There was no urgency, only a deep abiding pleasure in the connection itself, a silent conversation of touch and breath. He laid her back against the pillows, the sunlight warming her skin. He began a new exploration, a slow, deliberate journey mapped by his mouth. He traced the line of her collarbone, the gentle slope of her stomach, his breath a warm caress that left a trail of fire in its wake. A shuddering sigh escaped her as his lips followed the curve of her hip, his touch both a question and a promise. Her hands, which had been stroking his hair, now clutched it, her knuckles white. The world began to dissolve. The scent of coffee, the warmth of the sun, the sound of the waking city, it all faded, narrowing to a single perfect point of contact where his mouth met her skin. He moved lower still, to the heart of her, to the very centre of her warmth. And then she was lost. It was a sensory overload that stole her breath and scattered her thoughts. A deep humming current started low in her body, a silent song only he could compose. He worshipped her with a reverence that unmade her, patiently, devotedly, until the slow-building heat became an exquisite torment. Her back arched from the sheets, her head thrown back in a silent, desperate plea. Time ceased to exist. There was only the dizzying, spiralling pleasure he was coaxing from her, a wave of sensation that built and built until she thought she would shatter. When the peak finally came, it was not a cry, but a single, silent, shimmering tremor that shook her to her very soul. It was a wave of pure light and heat that crested and washed through her, leaving her boneless, breathless, and utterly, completely his. He moved up to capture her mouth in a slow, deep kiss, and she could taste herself on his lips, the intimate flavour of their shared devotion. It was the taste of her complete surrender and his absolute adoration, a seal on a promise made and kept. He held her face gently between his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. When they parted for a breath, their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw the entirety of their journey, the ballroom, the bookshop, the storm, the ruin, and now this sunlit peace. With a gentleness that made her want to weep with gratitude, he shifted, his body covering hers like a warm, welcome blanket. For a long moment he simply held her, their hearts beating in a steady, calming rhythm against each other. There was no urgency, only the profound rightness of being exactly where they belonged. It was not a taking, but a coming home. When their bodies finally joined, it was with a sigh of pure contentment from her, a sense of a lock turning, of a final missing piece of her soul clicking perfectly into place. He moved with her in a slow, languid dance, a timeless and unhurried rhythm that was about rediscovery, not release. His hands never stilled. They were a constant, adoring presence on her skin, stroking her hair from her brow, tracing the curve of her waist, his fingers linking with hers. She arched into him, a silent invitation to explore this new, peaceful country they had found together. The quiet tide of pleasure began to rise in them both, a warmth that started in their joined bodies and spread to the tips of their fingers and toes. It was a slow, shared ascent, climbing together, their gazes locked, their breaths mingling. The pleasure was not a sharp, frantic thing, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every part of them, a chord of perfect harmony. Their shared climax was not a shattering cry, but a soft, exhalant pulse, a quiet tremor that passed from his body to hers and back again, a peaceful and absolute completion that bound them in its gentle, shimmering afterglow. They lay tangled in the sheets for a long time after, the sun on their skin, the sound of the city a distant hum. Soon her breathless sighs gave way to soft, easy laughter, a sound of resilient, hard-won joy that filled the small sunlit room, and so they built their kingdom, not of marble and gold on a fashionable street, but of quiet moments and shared truths, a love that was not a prize to be won, but a harbour to be reached, together.